You're listening to Seminary Dropout, Episode 7. And welcome to the 7th episode of Seminary Dropout. I don't know if you know this, but the 7th episode is supposed to be kind of a milestone in podcasting. A lot of them don't make it to the 7th episode. It's kind of a glass ceiling, I guess you could say. But I don't know. Seems like it's going pretty well so far. Okay, don't screw this up, Shane. Listen, I want to do a few things a little bit differently. I'm kind of, the show's kind of evolving, and seeing as how it's a new year, I want to try out some new things. And one of those things that I want to not go straight into the interview at the beginning of the podcast. I want to talk a little bit about some other things first, do some housekeeping, stuff like that, and then we'll get into the great interview. So first, I want to say thank you to everybody who's left feedback for the podcast. It's been wonderful to get the Twitter direct messages, the emails, the comments. It's been so great, and I'm flattered, and also the reviews on iTunes and the ratings on iTunes, and those of course help to promote the show. And so I'm so thankful for those. It's just so humbling to get good feedback, and it's been overwhelmingly positive. I will say that one of the things that I've heard a few times here and there is that the sound quality could be better, and there are a few issues to work out. And so I want you to know that I'm hearing that, and no pun intended there. And am doing my best to make it better. I want this to be a high quality production and something that you can hear and it sounds like a professional quality, and I'm working on it. And so I confess I'm not a sound guy. I'm not even really a techie guy. And so I'm learning a whole lot. And so thanks for your patience during that time. And, as time goes on and I'm able to, I'm going to upgrade the equipment and it keep getting better and better. I think it's pretty, as far as equipment goes, I think it's pretty good. And if I could do some tweaks here and there, the equipment that I have is going to make the show sound really good if I utilize it to the best of its potential. So anyways, I just want to let you know that I do pay attention to that, and it does mean a lot to me that the sound quality is great for the show. One of those issues that I've discovered was, most of my interviews are over the phone, and I hope someday to do the majority of my interviews face to face, but right now it's not in the budget. I can't feasibly fly out to somewhere across the country to do an interview. I hope to be able to do that someday. So right now it's going to be remote, but one thing I figured out is that the sound quality of Skype is really superior to the sound quality over the phone. I'm probably the last guy to know that. You're probably sitting there and saying, well, yeah, duh, everybody knows that. Not everybody. Shane didn't know that. But I've done a few since then over Skype, and I thought the quality was great. So I'll probably be doing that from now on when I have to do remote interviews. I want to also during this time talk a little bit about my blog. I've told you before, when there's not a podcast published on a Monday, and my podcast is published every other Monday. On those Mondays where a podcast isn't published, I'm publishing a blog post on my blog at shaneblackshear.com. And so I want you to encourage you, if you're a blog reader, to, subscribe to a reader, or just put a bookmark there and go check it out. This last week, I posted a blog post about goals, and about how in the past I had really allowed the self-help gurus, the pop preachers, people like that to steal goal setting away from me, because I lumped in goal setting with those people with self-help and all those kind of cheap tricks and a pseudo gospel and even a health and wealth gospel that I kind of just didn't consider it important. And over the last year, I really have changed. And so it was a big deal to me to be able to get to the new year. And a couple of, I guess it was the night before New Year's Eve, my wife and I went to a coffee shop, sat down, and typed out some goals for the year. And I really, I really just feel like, and under the conviction that goal setting is really just about living life on purpose. And I want to live life on purpose. And I'm not one of those A-type personalities. It's naturally driven. I have to work on it. I have to be very, very purposeful. And so, I would just encourage you to think about that. Go look at that blog post for the details on that. But yeah, so give me your feedback on that. I'd love to hear what you think. I look at the comments on my blog and respond to, I'd say 95% of them, and even the old ones. Even if you comment on a blog that's 6 months ago, I'll still see it and respond to it. So I'd love to hear your feedback on that. Let's talk about my guest today. I talk a little bit about this in the interview, but I first read her words on Rachel Held Evans' blog and really, really loved and appreciated what she had to say. And so I went to her blog, read some more, and I thought, I've got to have this person on the show. I'll save the details for the interview, but my guest today is blogger and speaker working on her first memoir, Grace Biskie. Grace, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I came across your writings on Rachel Held Evans' blog, and you had written a great blog about racial reconciliation in the church, which is something that I'm very interested in. And so, and then I went over to your blog and started reading your posts and just loved your voice and the things that you had to say. And so I guess I'd like to just start off the interview by asking you to tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what that was like and kind of how that shaped who you are today.
I'm biracial, and my father's African American and my mom's Italian American, and my mom was the one who primarily raised me, and she was working for the Detroit Police Department at the time, and she had to live in the city. But white flight was kind of sweeping through, and she was one of the last white families left in our neighborhood. So I was raised in this really unique situation where my white siblings had been raised in a white neighborhood, but were all of a sudden the minorities in their neighborhood, and where my mom and family were a little bit hesitant to engage there, and feeling their own sense of racism against them. And so, as a consequence of that, my brother, I guess I won't say his name, but anyway, my brother just became this really big, just a very big racist, and made it hard for me to negotiate what it meant for me to grow up as a biracial kid with white family, one part of the town, a black family, another part of town. And I think that's where a bit of confusion came in for me. I think also, I guess I should say that my mom and dad, neither of them were really talking to me about what it meant to be biracial. I'm late 30s, so this was in late 70s, early 80s, when it just wasn't as common to be biracial, or there just wasn't as many biracial kids. So that was just very different everywhere I went, and not having a lot of conversations about what that meant, if it was okay. And my brother, meanwhile telling me, like, you shouldn't be black, you shouldn't try to be black, and don't talk black, and saying things like that. And I just thought, like, what does that even mean?
Yeah. So, and you mentioned your brothers and your sisters, and so they were not biracial. So these are half brothers and sisters.
Yeah. So my mom had 3 kids in her first marriage before me, and then my dad had 5 boys in his first 3 marriages before me. So so all my brothers on my dad's side are African American, and all my white siblings from my mom are white.
And did you all live together at some point?
No. Mm-mm. That would have been interesting, though.
Okay.
So anyway, so I I think that's a little bit of where where for me as a younger kid, I just started developing a real sense of just a real heightened awareness of race and racism, and just found that it was very prevalent in most places. And also, I grew up in the Midwest in Michigan, where in the Detroit area, at least, it's very, very segregated. So, everywhere I went, it was either the white grocery store or the black grocery store. You know what I mean? The white side of town or the west side of town. So,
Yeah.
so some of that became exasperated. And it really took me, I would say, I don't know, between like 5 or 10 years to really come out of that in a way that wasn't racist myself and just completely jaded by not just everybody around me, but by the church too. I really felt the church wasn't exempt from, and my mom grew up taking me to a Baptist church, and I went to a Christian school.
Okay.
I felt like they were really no different than anyone else I had come across from.
In what way?
So yeah. Well, I think I mentioned this in the post, but I think part of the messages I was getting growing up was from my white family members and the kids in my school and their parents who I hung out with sometimes. I was getting this message of like, oh, you live in Detroit, it's not safe there. There's black people there, they're not safe. We're better than black people kind of attitude. But at home in Detroit with a lot of my friends, they were very much like, don't trust white folks, don't listen to them, don't befriend them. They want something from you, they have a motive, they're ignorant. There was several messages that I was getting. And it wasn't different whether or not the person was a Christian or whether or not they were Arab or whether or not they were atheist.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's kind of where for me, I think I just realized like, wow, this is a problem. And I just was happy to fall into it. Not happy to, but I just kind of fell into it naturally. And then I think the biggest thing for me that was probably the most heartbreaking was when I was about 11. I don't remember exactly, either 10 or 11. And I went forward to be baptized in my church, and they wouldn't baptize me because they were not baptizing black members at the time.
And that, okay, so that concept, I read that in one of your posts, and that concept is so crazy to me. What year would that have been?
It would have been 86, either 85, 86, or 87. I feel like I should know this by now, but I can't remember.
Yeah.
So it was either like 10 or 11. I was right around that time.
Yeah. So like, if you just told me that story and I didn't know how old you were, I would say, that took place in, probably in the 60s or somewhere like that. But right. You're talking about in the mid 80s in my lifetime.
Right. Yeah.
And so what did that do to you? Like, what message did that send to you as an 11-year-old?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I really feel like God's grace was very much on my life, because my immediate reaction to that was, it's so sad that these white people are so ridiculous and off kilter. I didn't blame God or get angry at God. I felt like, God, your people are crazy. They're wrong, and they're racist, and they're judgmental. I probably went over on the deep end of like stereotypes and things like that, but I didn't initially blame God, and I think I really am thankful that didn't happen.
Yeah.
I didn't assign it to God.
Right. And I would think that would be natural, that if this is who you are, then I don't want any part of you. But for some reason that didn't occur to you. Did you have good examples of godly people in your life who weren't that way?
No.
Not at all.
I really didn't. I guess I would say, sometimes as I've looked back on this, actually working on the memoir, as I've looked back, I've really tried to see the good that I didn't see growing up. What were the good strands of things that were happening? Where was God's grace happening when as a kid I just didn't see that? And I think when I look back now, I can see that my mom, who is white, is, at that time she was a very faith person. And my mom became a believer when she was pregnant with me.
Oh, wow.
And that's actually a really interesting story too, because a white pastor tried to kill me. I'm kind of joking, but really my mom went to like a pastor in her neighborhood who told her that she should abort me because
oh my gosh,
I was black. essentially. And and my mom actually did the same thing. She didn't assign that to God. She assigned it to that pastor being kind of crazy. And she just thought, like, I don't care what color my baby is, I'm going to have her. So she found some Bible believing people and came to know the Lord while she was pregnant with me. So anyway, so she had been a really safe person, and I think I knew that she was a baby Christian in some ways. And I mean, looking back, I know now she didn't really have anyone who was discipling her. You know, she was a single mom. All the men in her life were pretty much horrible losers, and including my dad. And she didn't have a lot of support. And she had a crazy son. I think she was doing the best she could, and I think I knew that at the time. So I guess I would say she was probably my one safe person who I knew was a Christian, even though I knew she wasn't like, you know, an evangelist or whatever. But she was still
that positive
she
example.
Was an example of So I think it was. I don't know why if that's why that happened or whatever, but I think I also knew from what she had introduced me to in terms of faith that that's what I knew of God that was separate from what the church did.
Sure.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And so, okay, so you have at 11, you have this terrible experience. So I guess you come to faith at around 11 years old, and you have this terrible experience at this church. What then in your spiritual life? What happens after that?
I guess I would correct you a little bit. I don't feel like I came to faith at 11. I think I prayed with my mom when I was pretty young and had somewhat an understanding of the Lord. And it was just at 11 that I wanted to walk. Sure. I really wanted to walk forward and do the believer baptism thing, you know?
Right.
Because I was at a Baptist church.
Okay.
But I'd say what happened then, because my mom was sending me to a private Christian school that whole time. So I was kind of learning about God, but I think at that point on, I became more and more and more skeptical about what it actually meant to follow Jesus, because I just saw more and more racism. I think that was a big block for me because I just didn't know anyone who wasn't like very outwardly racist towards like, even my mom had her struggles and her, I even talk to her about it now that when I was growing up, we always turned right to go out to our errands. Turn right was going into the white neighborhood. So there were subtle messages there too. But
yeah,
I think that was a really big hindrance to me while I was at those Christian schools, because I think I just assumed everyone was fake. And I also didn't know. I just didn't know what it looked like. I just had no idea, like, what does it really look like for someone to be following God? Because I think I found that almost everyone at my school, my Christian school, we were all kind of like, we knew what to say in chapel and Bible class, but we were all just living our own way,
Yeah.
So I think in the absence of like seeing that, and this is too before the internet, so it's not like I was reading, some Christian teenager's blog or something. I just
right.
didn't really know what it meant. So really, I would say really nothing changed for me until I got to college, and I became more desperate for God in high school, and just more down and out. Things started falling apart at home. So that when I got to college, I was really poised I wasn't really at a good place because I was really at my lowest low.
Okay.
And then when I finally saw some of the InterVarsity kids, I got involved with the campus ministry called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And once I saw some of them, and I could see pretty early on, like, these kids are legit,
Yeah.
And some of them were African American too, and that was huge. That was just huge for me. And once I saw, like, wow, they have like an actual faith that actually permeates their day in and day out. That's when it became intriguing for me.
Sure. So I want to go back real quick to the private school that you went to growing up. What was that? Predominantly white?
Yeah, it was. I would say there were maybe, at the time I thought it was almost all white, but now when I look back at yearbooks, I'm surprised to see there's probably like 2 to 4 African American kids in every class, at least 2 to 4. So yeah, it felt like less at the time.
Yeah. So
yeah, it was predominantly white.
So you mentioned the kind of the sentiment or the attitude seemed to be very racist. how do you feel like they responded to you personally there? Did you feel like you were liked by the staff, faculty? Did you have friends there? What was that like for you?
It's interesting. I would say both of those things happened. So I was just writing about this the other day. So I'm glad you're asking this question. I had, a teacher in sixth grade who I was just convinced was like the biggest racist ever. And I really feel like, some people might think I'm crazy, but I still feel like I have memories of him like treating me and the other black kids in the class worse.
Mm-hmm.
But then for example, I have teachers in my high school who I can remember were just great to me. And actually some of them I'm still friends with. Like one of them I'm still friends with, like on Facebook,
Yeah.
And then, so there's two girls who are a great example of kind of my life in school. In seventh grade, this one girl named Andrea, her mom, we were great friends. We hung out every day. We were in the latchkey program after school together. But when she had a party, she flat out told me, like, hey, you can't come to my house because my mom doesn't let black people come to our house.
Yeah.
She just said it, like, there you go,
Just very matter of factly, it sounds like.
Yeah, and not even like it was wrong. Like, oh, you understand, don't you? She kind of said it with a smile on her face. And
yeah.
By that point, I did understand, And then the other example is my friend named Jenny, this girl who I became great friends with also in the seventh grade, whose parents just were great to me, and I loved them and was around her family a lot because I was best friends with her all through high school, junior high and high school. But her dad had flat out told her, like, hey, if you ever bring a black dude home, I'm going to get out my shotgun and kill him.
Yeah.
So I kind of knew that, but they still loved me and treated me well, even though I knew that Jenny couldn't bring home a black dude to date, but she could bring home me and they would treat me well.
Right.
I had a lot of instances like that. Actually, probably like 4 of my good friends, their parents felt that similar way. Like, oh, you're okay, but everybody else is not okay.
Right.
Not for my daughters, that kind of thing. So I always knew that there was tension. And I don't think in terms of how the kids treated me every day, I think we all were, especially in high school, it was a little bit more diverse, and then in junior high, I think we were all okay with each other, although there was fights. I remember, fights about racial issues, a little bit of tension, but I was never in them because I avoid pain at all costs, so I don't mess with anybody.
So I'm curious if we were able to go back in time and find you in high school, what would you have said about who God was? I'm curious about your life up until that point and all that you've experienced and some good things, but a lot of ugly things as well. Who was God to you in that point in your life?
I think I felt like that I really did believe in Jesus, and I believed that Jesus was God's son. I didn't have an understanding of the cross, of what that meant and all that could mean for me. But I think I felt like, I do remember several times feeling like God could help me. I was in some of the situations I was in high school, but basically at that point, my father had left for prison. He went to prison for abusing me. I was really just going through this, I think a little bit of a post-traumatic stress, look back at it now, where I was, kind of steeped in depression. I was in this relationship with a guy that just wasn't unhealthy in any way. It wasn't healthy. So I was feeling the effects of that, and I felt like, I think God can help me get out of this relationship, and I think God could help me. I remember thinking that a lot, but I just didn't feel like I had access. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like
I would pray every now and then, but didn't know, like, is that getting through, or do I need to do something for that to get through?
Right.
Or, or kind of like, do I have to? I think because the school came out of the Baptist church that I grew up in, and it, not to hate on Baptists or anything, but I find that the downside of Baptists is it can be more legalistic. So I kind of, had that legalistic mindset kind of seeped in a little bit. Like, I must, especially on sex, sex is a huge, like, you're a sinner if you have sex with me. So, I'm in high school having sex. So I was like, well, God is surely not hearing me
Right.
because
Right.
I'm having sex and I'm a high schooler.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is the
So there was
Baptist
that,
unforgivable
you
sin.
know,
Uh,
yeah.
um, so, so it sounds like you go off to college, and it kind of sounds like, some things were redeemed for you there through the group at InterVarsity and the people that you meet there.
Oh, yeah. I would say it was like, major life transformation, 180-degree turnaround once I started getting involved with InterVarsity. Basically, the guy who was heading up the group at the time, he was African American. He was really the first person I saw who had this really, like I said, intriguing faith. And he was black, so it was just kind of like, oh, I need to really learn from this guy. And he's the one who challenged me to consider, like, maybe you're not really following the Lord. Here's what that could look like. And he gave me time and space to decide. He was like, why don't you just think about this? And I'll give you a few things to think about and ask you some questions. And so basically over the course of 8 months, I really took that time to decide, like, am I going to really live for Jesus? And he laid out for me, like, here's what that would look like. And it does mean you need to make some different choices. So he really gave me a very realistic picture of what it can mean to live a life of faith. And so that by the time those 8 months were over, well, first I had made like some of the worst choices in my life because I was partly thinking, maybe I don't want God, maybe I
Sure.
don't want this path. But then after those 8 months were over, I felt a little bit broken down, like almost like I was at the bottom and the Lord was all I had left. So it's kind of like, and I believe you, I'm going to give you a chance. And then things just really changed. I would say almost like overnight, like dramatically. Dramatically, my relationships with men became very, very different, and family, and what I did with my time, and I got very heavily involved with InterVarsity at Wayne State. So I became a Bible study leader. I think that was like the first time I ever felt like, oh, I'm really doing something now.
Yeah.
Like I'm doing something that makes me feel like I have accountability. I think that's what happened there.
Did
So yeah, that was a huge transition.
Was it when you said you went through a change in a relatively short period of time? Was that Did people who knew you before, maybe family or just people from back home, was that hard for them to accept, or were they kind of out of the loop at that point? What was that like?
I don't think it was hard for anyone to accept. I think what happened though, this is actually kind of a sad thing when I look back on it because it was so subtle. But what happened was, I most of my friends at the time before I came to really follow the Lord were a lot of my friends from Wayne State, or from back in my neighborhood. And so the things we did together were, clubbing or going out to bars or whatever, that kind of thing. So once I came to like really follow the Lord and I got more involved with my university friends, it also took me out of the great thing is I wasn't going to nightclubs, I wasn't going to bars and things like that. But it also took me away from all of my African American friends because they were the ones doing that all. And at that point, like some of my newer friends were all my white friends who were really trying to live right. So it almost like put me in the separation. So I remember after a year, a few of my friends being like, I never see you. So I don't think they thought, oh, it's because of God. He thinks you're too good for me or anything like that. It was just because I became so heavily invested and I wanted there to be such a dividing line between the activities I was doing before and after. And not because it wasn't even from a legalistic standpoint. It was more because I knew like that is so much to my detriment. I
Yeah.
just can't go those places anymore because and I knew that was kind of my weakness and I knew I just shouldn't go there. So anyway, but the nice thing is I realized that after about a year and a half, and then I realized like I need to have a more integrated life and I can't run from my non-Jesus following friends. So I kind of figured out like how can I be in their world with them and not be a part of the crazy.
Right. Right.
Um, yeah, and that actually was really good. And then also York, who was the guy who discipled me, he challenged me to really try to bring more African Americans into our student chapter. And I started doing that. And once I started doing that, that was really when I saw some conversion of like all the ways and the gifts that God had given me coming together, and all the ways that I had my whole life really had two foots in two worlds. And really, I know how to I know how to be in a room with white people. I'm not, I'm not intimidated. I could speak to a group of white people. I've spoken at all white churches, in the past couple of years. I also know that, in an African American crowd, so I find that that has been, I think, one of the biggest gifts of the way I was raised, that I can often bring people together because I can speak both of their languages.
Right.
So yes, I think that once that started happening, that's when I realized, like, oh, I should do this for a living. So that's when I decided to join Stafford University at some point. I mean, like a year or two in, because I realized, like, I would love doing this, and I would love sort of being a bridge and talking about these issues and helping people to understand one another and all of that stuff.
Sure. So, at what point did you meet your husband?
I met him about. I'm only laughing because it was only about 5 months in of me coming to know the Lord. Actually, it wasn't even five. I really came to know the Lord in April of '96, and I met him in like June. It was
Okay.
only 2 months later, on an InterVarsity urban project. So we didn't get together right away. We didn't get together for like another 3 years after that. But we became really good friends through that project.
What did you had mentioned in one of your blog posts that um, he kind of redeemed uh, some of the sentiment that you had towards white people, um, that there was kind of some healing there. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say he I think because he was raised in an all-white small town in just outside of Lansing, in Michigan, and he just kind of embodied, I think, everything that growing up in Detroit I felt like I didn't like about small town white people who just didn't really, have any concern to figure out what it was like to live in African American shoes, and that was of course my stereotype.
Hmm.
Nevertheless, here he comes along. He was a great guy, and I think what happened was when we even considered dating, that's when we started having all these conversations, and I felt like I just need to even, get to know what you think about all this stuff because I can't even comprehend, like, being in a relationship with you without some understanding of all this. And he had just went so much out of his way even before I came along to displace himself amongst African Americans as an university staff after he was working at a different school and trying to pioneer ministry among an all-black gospel choir. And that had just that was his life-changing, revolutionary thing that God did, that changed the way that he began to think and deal with race relations in America, and especially how it pertains to evangelical Christianity and like how he approaches it. And so he was just coming from this whole other place. I was so impressed. I mean, he just really impressed me in the beginning. Like, wow, I have like never met a white man before who's like so thought through these issues and been through it himself.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think a lot of that healing honestly came after we were married, because obviously that deepened a relationship in any way, marriage, but
Yeah.
it just really deepened all of these conversations we were having, and we just came to realize in so many ways, even still, that we just really think the same way about a lot of issues. And, just as angry as he is, as I am over racism, he feels that too. About white privilege, he feels that too. And I think a lot of the work he's done for the past, because he's been on staff with the university for, I think, almost 15 years now, all the work that he's done for the past 15 years has been, the same, from trying to be a bridge builder and trying to really bring a lot of white people on the journey with him to like kind of travel through the stages that you need to really go through to be in a healthy place with others who are different around you. So so we just really think the same. And I think after, a good 5 years, so we got married in the 2000s, and then 9/11 was like a big catalyst for me in 2011 to really think through the racism that was in my heart. And I realized like 2 or 3 years after that how much Dave had been a part of healing. How he had really redeemed a lot of what I think living with my brother, my white brother, who was so racist, and living with Dave, then realizing what the opposite of, like, what does it look like to live with someone who's redeemed in this area who God has really worked in. So yes, I think I'm really thankful for that. And I think if I had, married a black man like I thought I would all along, and just done that, I think I wouldn't have really been forced to find the identity that God wanted me to have, you know,
Yeah.
because I would have just kind of rested in him, like, oh, we're just going to do this black thing over here.
Sure.
But I think I've been really forced to figure out who I am outside of days, you know, what is different and what's to celebrate and what does God have for me, and if that is beautiful and that he wants me to pursue.
Yeah. So you mentioned several things in there that I had wanted to ask you about. First is you mentioned 9/11 and the catalyst that was for you, and that you've written a blog post about that was
Mm-hmm.
one of your more popular ones. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I just realized on 9/11 I was so mad at America. So bad. I think because once the news started talking about, you know, this is the worst thing that's ever happened in U.S. soil, and I just heard it through the eyes, you know, through the eyes and ears of slaves, number one slaves, but number two Native Americans. And I just felt like, you know, this whole country was like founded on torture and terror, and then, you know, that's just the Native Americans, and then we stole these people from a different continent, brought them here, and tortured and terrorized them for a couple hundred years. And then we want to say this one day is the worst thing. So it just kind of, it was so, it just really caught me off guard how much all of that anger came back. Like, I just like, this was such a lie. Like, how could we live such a lie? So that I think just made me really, really mad at white people all over again. Like, just a failure to acknowledge, like, there's been some horrible things that have happened in this country in addition to this.
Mm-hmm.
That failure to acknowledge that just enraged me, and I could barely, I mean, because I was at the time I was on staff at the university. I was working at Western Michigan University, and they asked all the staff on the campus to come in and like minister to students and pray for them, because they were all crying on every bench on campus.
Sure.
And I just couldn't. I was just sitting there with like my arms folded, and I just was like, God, we have to do something about this. I am a hot mess right now. I need somebody to pray for me, you know, like,
right.
about why I'm so mad. And also, I should say, in addition to that, my best friend in the world, who's really like a sister to me, is Arab American, and she the things that were happening to her in the first few days, her and her family after that were just horrible.
Sure.
So I was kind of hearing it from her end too, you know, kind of like what the racism that was affecting her. So I just realized I had to deal with it. It was real in my face. Like, I can't go on, because I felt like I just hated white people so much at that point. It just overcame me. And I think it really wasn't so much, you know, obviously not 9/11. It was the fact that brought up, because it was such an intense thing, it brought out every feeling of anger I had ever had, really is what it did.
Sure.
And just kind of put it on the table. And then I realized, like, I can't go on this way. I can't go on. I can't be a minister on campus. I can't, you know what I mean?
Right.
Interact with white folks and pretend like this. It was literally that, like, you have to go through a different door, or you have to just stop being a liar. So that's what like pushed me. And really, I would say that's why I feel like Dave was a really big part of that healing, because we had so many great conversations. And you know, the way the university responded, because I was really honest with my supervisor and a lot of my staff team, and the way they responded, I think, was so gracious too. And at the time I was working with a lot of white men as well, so they were so gracious, and they kept putting me in situations to have to face it even more, which at the time I think I was annoyed by.
Sure.
You know, like, we have to do a week of training, and they were putting me in with like the University of Wisconsin whitewater students who
Wow.
you know, were asking me questions like, is it okay for me to ever use the N-word in any situation?
Oh my
You
gosh.
know? And, you know, I don't know, I'm really laughing about it now, but really there was a lot about that was really healing. Just because I had to face it. It was like, you know, learning a new language very quickly, kind of just being thrown in and saying, like, this is not an option. You know, God tells us we cannot hate our brother. So,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think over the course of those, like, I don't know, maybe 3-ish years, there was a tremendous amount of healing that happened, and I got to a place where I even said that I wanted to celebrate that God had made me half white, and what that meant for me. Not to deny that was part of my heritage, and that's I didn't have kids yet, but that's, you know, a big part of my kids' heritage, what it was going to be. And I know I was scared of that, but I didn't want to push my racism off on them. So I wanted
Sure.
to get to a place of healing before I even had kids, you know. So there was just, yeah, a lot of good came out of that as well, as hard as it was in the beginning.
The other thing that you had mentioned that I wanted to follow back up on was you mentioned um, privilege and white privilege, and that's something that I've been extremely um, interested in, just that phenomenon. And I think that I think that when um, I think that when most white folk like myself hear that word, that it can be offensive, and I think that
Hmm.
it's something that
Yeah.
I've thought about a lot, and I think that the reason it can be offensive is from a white person's standpoint. I think what they think is, um, so I grew up and I went to school and I worked hard and to get into college, and then I worked really hard to make good grades in college, and maybe worked a part-time job, and then I entered the job just like everybody else, and um, and I struggled to pay the bills like everybody else, um, and so we might catch ourselves thinking, what is privileged about that? And I think that we're taught that I think that we're taught that racism was something that happened a long time ago, and we've fixed those things through um, through laws that we've passed, and our attitudes have changed, and things like that, and I think that the conversation of privilege is one that has been happening somewhat in the secular world a lot, but I don't think that we talk about it in the church context a lot, or in the Christian context a lot,
Yeah. Hmm.
really to our detriment. And I think we're afraid of offending each other. We don't know the right vocabulary to use, the right language to use to have that conversation. And so I think we just don't have it. And I think it's to our detriment. So talk a little bit about that, and help us work through that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I do feel that, and I do sense that, because I think it can, as soon as you say it, white privilege, like it can be guilt-inducing, which I think is just a really sad thing. So, I think the first thing to think about, if you're a random white person listening to this podcast, is to try not to be defensive right away, and just kind of, you know what I mean, kind of
Yeah.
work through it a little bit, because I think that my hope is that anyone would take it as a principle and apply it to their life and think, this is a reality. This is a reality. So is this something that I have or partake in? There's a book that I always recommend. It's called More Than Equals by Spencer. Oh my goodness. It's been such a long time since I read it. I don't remember their names. I will get it before we get off this podcast.
I know the book you're talking about, and I'll be sure to
Yeah.
include it in the
Okay.
show notes of the blog post. So yeah, so if you're listening,
Great.
definitely go to the blog, and I'll have it there.
Okay. So one of the analogies that they give in the book that I think is really helpful is to think about, at least in America, blacks and whites playing a game of baseball, and whites are getting ahead, by eighth whatever inning. Some of the white people on the team realize that all of the black players have one of their arms tied behind their back, and just kind of seeing like, oh, maybe that's why they're behind in the game. And of course, he says it so much more eloquently than I just explained it. But it's just kind of the concept of that the way things have happened in the last, 200, 300 years. Well, first, just understanding that African Americans are a brand new people group. So there's challenges just in that happening, like just kind of considering history, all the things that have happened to get us to the place where we are now, has meant, it's using the game analogy, that whites are ahead just by default, because of how African Americans got started here as an enslaved group who was free, with nothing. And then, of course, I'm not going to give you a history lesson, but we all know about everything that happened up until the 60s and the civil rights movement. So it's really just been in these last 50 years that there's been some tremendous changes, which is wonderful. But I'm a firm believer that we're not in a post-race society. And I know people love to throw that around after Obama was elected,
Sure.
but I don't think that was the case. But there's another resource, and if I can find you the link, I'll send it to you. But there's another resource that we've used in university that I really like, and it's basically at the top of it, it just says white privilege checklist. And when we do training on these kind of things, we give the students it, and we just say, like, again, don't try not to feel guilty, and don't own any guilt that you don't need to feel right now, but just go through and check off these things. And they're things that deal with all aspects of life. So it deals with obviously your financial background, the kind of environment you were raised in, how many languages you were taught, those kind of things. Even things that people might not have thought of. Often the things that white students tell me, like, I have never thought of that, are things like, when I go into a store, I don't ever think I'm being followed because I'm a white man.
Right.
Or you can apply that to being pulled over. Or even little things like, I never consider what color Band-Aid I'm going to get because I always assume that it's going to match my skin color. That sounds like such a little thing. But it's, if you take that little thing and apply it to all areas of life of what it means to live in America, that's the small thing, and there's this full spectrum. And so when you add it all up, there's so many things that means it's easier, and there's privileges that you get, and it's easier to get ahead from the white. And I say probably most people would agree with me. The hierarchy is, white man, and then white woman, and then down you go from there. So yeah, I think it's always, like I said before, always hard and sad that it can be a little bit guilt-inducing. But there's also ways I have seen some white people just really, really thrive once they get some knowledge and understanding of what this means, and they take a sense of ownership, and once they kind of, a light bulb goes off in their head, like, oh my gosh, I have privilege in these areas, and I'm going to use my privilege for the good of others. I love seeing that light bulb click. Because I think that myself. I think, I'm a light-skinned woman. I live in America. I'm middle class. How can I use my privilege for those things to help and bring others along who have way less than me and way less privilege and way less power and way less money. So I think it's something you can think along, wherever you're at.
So what are those things? What are things that for white guys like me, what can we do to not be a part of that system, to do, like you said, to use that for good? What can be done to use that for good?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Obviously I think it's going to be different for everybody depending on, where you're at in life and what you can do. And it's going to be different for you than, say, a lawyer. You're not a lawyer on the side, are you?
No, unfortunately not, no.
But you know what I mean? Like, it's going to be really different for where your privilege lies, So in some ways there's no easy answer, but I think some of the more general answers are financially, I think, and again, this really applies to everyone because this applies to me too, but I think we always have to think, like, where is our money going, and what ways can we use that for the good of others, in terms of where you're giving, and even nowadays, it's getting more complicated, but where you're spending too, and knowing some of that money goes to crazy places and some of it funds really good things. I think money is always a big one. But I think, if I were just going to use you, for example, I think in part you're doing that. Right now you're giving a voice to an African American woman, right, for an hour.
Sure.
So in your context, I think you are extending your platform, if that makes sense. But for someone else, that's going to be really different. So I think part of me wouldn't even want to give more specific answers, because I think that's the internal work we each need to do.
Right.
Right. It's not ever probably going to be easy. And I think anytime I've ever seen, and I have now, because I've been around university so long, and there's just so many good people who work for university, and so many students who are really just turning into, like, world transforming believers. I think I've really seen a lot of people like use their power and privilege for good, and it really does look different, and it really is complicated, and it really is hard. It's like it's not an easy thing to reorient your life when you could be, like there's couples I know who there are a lot of university alumni who completely reoriented where they live because of some of these calls, and they feel very specifically called to live in urban areas, and they could just go get their suburban house with the white picket fence, and they've chosen that too. And sometimes I've been in awe and shocked and humbled, it's a sacrifice
Yeah.
that they've made because they really want to make a difference in different areas of society or in different neighborhoods, and it's awe-inspiring and it's beautiful. But I think it's different for everyone about how much you can handle,
Sure. I love that you said that because it's kind of a big one with me and kind of a pet peeve. I think that we worship safety more than God, and safety has become a real idol for us. And in
Mm-hmm.
that, when you talk about, I'll just use this example. I live in Austin now, but before I lived in a smaller town, and there was the public housing in this small town, and man, tons of churches would have all these ministries there where they would go and they would, maybe they'd feed them lunch or they would do some kind of, worship service or something like that. But none of those people who went and did those things lived in that neighborhood. And
Mm.
obviously, some for economic reasons couldn't live in public housing, but but they could live close. They could live in the same neighborhood. Um, and it was just very obvious to me that to really minister to people, we really have to live with them, and do life with them. And it can't be this one-off thing where we go and do the good deed. And I see it so much where people in all areas of their life are very concerned about following Christ's example. But if you talk about, well, why don't you go live in this neighborhood? Why don't you go do life with these people? And it's out of the question. It's not even, we're not even going to pray about it. It's no, God doesn't want my kids to grow up in that neighborhood. I've decided. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's a big one. Are there other things? Is it a separate list of things that we can do to bring racial reconciliation to the church, or are all those one and the same?
Hmm. Honestly, I'll tell you, I've been in parachurch ministry for so long that I have not given much thought about what it looks like in a church setting. Like, if that makes sense, like my mindset is so different
Yeah, sure.
that I just haven't thought about it too much. I know I've seen and heard about good examples. Like I heard about, I'm not sure if you've heard of this, like Willow Creek and some other Chicago area churches were doing these bus trips together where they were like heading down to the south somewhere, and like like a remnant of each church, 30 members from each church going together, riding in a bus together, doing discussions, book discussions, and I've heard things like that, and I thought, like, that sounds powerful. I know every church can't do it, but it to me was a really good example of people getting in each other's face for at least a week,
Yeah, yeah.
to facilitate these discussions where no one's outnumbered and there's a little bit of the safety in numbers. So yeah, I have yet to see what this looks like, and I can tell you honestly, I've never in my life went to a church that's multi-ethnic. Which I would love to someday. I hope to someday.
Yeah, yeah. Same here.
But
Same here. I really I don't know. I kind of hurt for that. That
yeah, me too.
Yeah. So the other thing that you mentioned tangentially was um, you talked about like celebrating the uniqueness of different cultures, and a lot of some things that we hear from that white people are most guilty of is saying things like that they're colorblind and stuff like that seem helpful but are really not. Can you kind of unpack for us why those things are not exactly the answer to the problem?
I'm sorry that I'm laughing. I shouldn't do that. I think because it's one of the harder ones for me because I think because it represents like a layer back, even a layer of a misunderstanding. That I think it's just a hard starting place too. But I will say I've had this conversation with my own sister, who is my own stepsister, who's white, who had said, like, I'm trying to raise my kids colorblind. So the first discussion I ever got into with this was with my own sister. So that was actually helpful, a helpful beginning place. But I think that mentality says, it says, I'm not going to think about you any differently or acknowledge that you're different, which is coming from a place of privilege because you don't have to. Whereas the person who is the minority absolutely has to acknowledge that they're different, that you're different, that we need to interact different and speak different, and maybe even do things differently just to get by. So it's a privilege for you to even be able to declare that. I'm not going to see you any differently, whereas I have to see you differently. Or I'm not going to treat you any differently, whereas the minority has to treat differently. If you think about, like I said earlier, if you think about being pulled over, there's different protocols. There's a reason why little black kids get lessons. They get homeschooled from their parents on how to get pulled over.
Right.
Because you have to acknowledge that difference, especially if you're, an African-American 16-year-old boy getting pulled over by a white man. You're going to have to acknowledge the differences. So I think the colorblind thing, what I told my sister that day, because I was trying to explain this to her, and it was just a very hard conversation, but I was saying, like, if there's someone who's disabled, let's say they've lost both their legs and they're in a wheelchair, what would it look like for me to say to them if you take race completely out of the equation, just that scenario? What would it look like for me to say to them, like, I'm not going to treat you any differently. So we're going to go out and play football, and I'm just not even going to acknowledge that you don't have legs or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think there's a bit of the choosing what you want to see and choosing what you don't want to see, choosing that which is too difficult to see, that comes into that mentality a little, the colorblind mentality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
I guess, let me say one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the way to combat that is and what I'm trying to teach our kids is to see everyone and celebrate all the differences that everyone embodies and encapsulates. So you don't treat them differently in a way that's poorly, obviously, but acknowledge, like, that person, like for my son Ransom, he has a Chinese American boy in his class. So for him to acknowledge, like, you are different from me. How can I celebrate your difference? How are you different? Like, what are your family backgrounds that I would love to know, or, those kind of things. Now, obviously he's only first grade, so he's going to need to learn a lot about how to interact with people and then go to people and say, hey, you're different.
Right.
But the mentality is still there. Like, I would like to acknowledge that you're different, and I would like to love and honor your culture. How can I do that?
Sure.
And I think it's powerful when kids learn that from a young age, and that's something I wish I had learned from a young age.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers.
Yes, I loved that book.
I did too, and I think it really helped me to get a better grasp on what you're saying, on being able to acknowledge and celebrate the difference, without obviously without being racist, and that's one I recommend. We'll put that in the show notes as well. I love that book, and it wasn't totally. It's not really, the book isn't even really about race, but it touches on that, and like I said, gives a better understanding on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I thought it was really helpful about that too, especially about the airline pilots and how that was playing in the crashes and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. And I think Malcolm Gladwell himself is biracial, so he's got some personal anecdotes there about that. Well, Grace, anything else that you want to leave with us?
No, I don't think so. It was fun.
I'm glad that you've had fun. I have absolutely Just loved everything that you've had to say thus far, and we're coming up on an hour, and I feel like if I wanted to, we could probably go a few more. But I will respect your time and say thank you so much. And where can people find you? Where's your presence on the web?
Yeah, my blog is www.gabbingwithgrace.com, and I'm a slow, light Twitter user right now. I'm trying to be better with Twitter, but mostly on my blog, and
Okay.
hopefully soon I'll be finished with my book eventually.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. So real quick, talk to us about that. It's just it's a memoir, correct?
Yeah, it's a memoir called Detroit's Daughter, and it's just going to talk about my life growing up in Detroit, facing poverty and abuse and racism and Christians and boys,
That
basically.
that's awesome. Is there
Yeah.
a tentative arrival date for that book?
No, I'm thinking later this year or early next year. That's what I'm hoping. But
Okay.
yeah, I think the best way to keep up with me is on my blog, because I love to kind of give updates now and then about what's going on with the book, and I'm trying to bring as many people in to give me the rah rah, because it's at that real hard place for finishing.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. All right. Well, Grace, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
After this interview, Grace and I were talking, and she asked when this episode would be published. I told her I would publish one the next Monday, and then I would publish hers 2 weeks after that. I didn't realize when I said that it would be MLK Jr. Day. So I didn't plan this, but I think it's pretty cool that it panned out this way. I'd like to close the show with just a very short story. 2 years ago, when Kate and I had just moved to Austin, we were looking for a church home. On the Sunday before Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we visited 2 different churches, one in the morning and one at night, and the one at night would eventually become our church home. We heard 2 of probably the best sermons I've ever heard that day. They were both about Martin Luther King Jr. and his life and his work. And on that day, I listened to the words of his I Have a Dream speech with new ears. I'd heard it before a lot as a kid, and kind of like maybe some Bible verses that you grew up with, they kind of lose meaning over the years. But that day I heard it with new ears, and the word that kept coming to mind when I heard the speech was Christ-like. Because Jesus didn't come and say, here's a set of rules you need to follow. I don't care if you like them or not. I don't care if you like me, but you need to follow through with them. Just follow the rules. No. He came for the hearts of men and women, not just going through the motions of morality. He wanted us to love him. And when I listened to the I Have a Dream speech that day, I noticed something. Although he spoke rightly about equality on a governmental level, he didn't stop there. If he had stopped there, he wouldn't have said things like, I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. And he wouldn't have said, one day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. When I heard those words again for the first time, I realized he didn't just want laws to force us to treat each other fairly. He wanted us to love each other. That's it for today. Thank you so much, each and every one of you who listen to this show. It means the world to me. Remember, you can find me, Shane Blackshear, on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter at BeardOnABike. And, of course, read the blog, ShaneBlackshear.com. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.